You're listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We believe the Bible doesn't need to be watered down or cleaned up to be understood. Our goal is to provide a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. I'm your host, Colin Connor. Now, on to the episode. Hey everyone, welcome back to our ongoing series on the biblical book of Nehemiah. It's been a little while since we've been here. We've had several weeks of interviews and other conversations going on with the podcast, and I hope you have enjoyed those. I know I enjoyed recording them, and I thought there was some really good content we put out in the last several weeks. But here we are, back in Nehemiah. It always feels like coming back to home base when we return to these Bible series. It's like the bread and butter for the podcast every year. We get to do these. So let's talk about Nehemiah chapter 3 this week. And you know, if any of you have ever read through this chapter before, I just want to congratulate you. Like, seriously, that is a big feat to get through a chapter like this. It's the equivalent of sitting through the end credits of a movie because your friend leaned over and whispered, "Don't leave yet, there's a post-credit scene." And so you sit through several minutes watching the names of assistant costume designers and the guy responsible for catering the set in New Zealand, and you wonder, was my friend lying to me? Is there actually going to be anything at the end of all this? So Nehemiah chapter 3 is kind of the post-credit scene of Nehemiah. It's just not at the end of the book. And that's because Nehemiah and Ezra are not necessarily chronologically written. They're cyclical. They jump around. It's kind of like Chris Nolan's Memento or watching like Pulp Fiction or something like that, right? The storytelling isn't always linear. And while this chapter may at first look like just a boring list of names and construction assignments, if you slow down and ask why it's here, it becomes a pretty fascinating chapter. And hopefully by now, if you've listened to some of our previous episodes, particularly in Genesis, you know not to shut your brain off when reading a genealogy or a list of names in the Bible. There is always interesting information there. We just have to dig a little extra to find it. I don't believe this chapter is here, this list of names is here just to make sure that the ancient authors had a complete record of everyone working on the wall. And that is a part of it, but I don't think that's the main thing going on here, because ancient authors don't waste ink. Think about it. These people did not have Microsoft Word. They didn't accidentally leave 6 pages of construction notes in the final draft. They did not have a delete key that they forgot to press. Writing was expensive back then. Materials were expensive. Scribes were highly trained specialists. So if a chapter full of names is preserved and copied for thousands of years, we should assume that the author thought those names mattered. Nehemiah is like a monument built out of words, not just stones. And that changes the way we should read this chapter. Because while this chapter certainly is a dusty corner of Scripture that doesn't get brought up too often, I have heard it misused in sermons as a lesson about volunteering. Look at all these ordinary people who did ordinary work, and God recorded their names forever. So make sure you sign up for the nursery next Sunday. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with volunteering in your local faith community, but there is something about this chapter that goes deeper than just asking people to help out with your latest project. The people in this list are ordinary people. They're perfume makers, goldsmiths, merchants, people from small towns, their families, temple servants. But if that's all we focus on, we miss the scale of what is happening here. Because these people didn't just wake up one morning and say, you know what would be a great community service project? Let's rebuild the city wall. These are trauma survivors living in the aftermath of a catastrophe. Jerusalem had fallen to Babylon. The temple had been destroyed. The monarchy had ended. The people were taken to exile. The promises that had shaped Israel's understanding of the world looked like they had collapsed. Remember the larger story that we've been tracing all the way back to Genesis. It always goes back there, right? Humanity is constantly trying to move from chaos back into order. The Garden of Eden represented a world where heaven and earth existed in harmony. Exile from Eden was not simply being kicked out of a nice garden. It represented the fracturing of the relationship between God, humanity, creation, and each other. And Israel's exile from Jerusalem becomes a replay of that story. They are cast out of their land, and the city is left in ruins. The place where God's presence was thought to dwell with humanity had been devastated. So when these people try to rebuild Jerusalem, they're not just fixing infrastructure. They are trying to put a broken world back together. They're trying to make sense of their systems that completely fell apart for them the last 100 years. That's the heartbeat behind this chapter. Think with me about the first city built in Genesis. Cain builds a city after his exile. And then later, humanity gathers together at Babylon and builds a tower to make a name for themselves. Ancient empires built these massive walls as demonstrations of their power. Look at how strong we are. Look at how permanent we are. Look at how no one can ever take this away from us. But Nehemiah is a different kind of wall. This is the first major wall in the biblical story that is being built, and the story is being told of it, not because the people believed they were invincible, but because they knew exactly how vulnerable they are. That doesn't make everything that happens later in Nehemiah automatically good. We are going to have some very difficult conversations as the book progresses about boundaries, purity, identity, and whether the methods that help a traumatized people survive are always the same methods that help them flourish later on. But I don't want to rush past the humanity of these builders. They watch their world collapse. And so now, of course, they're rebuilding. Of course, they're trying to recover what was lost. Of course, they're hoping that the restoration of Jerusalem means that the old promises to Israel are finally being renewed, that their wounds of exile are starting to heal, and that the fractured relationship between God, land, and creation can be restored. So, with all that in mind, Nehemiah 3 takes us on a walk around the wall. Literally, that's what's going to happen in this chapter. And I think there's a lot of interesting details that we're going to pull out that I'm willing to bet you have never heard before in church. So let's get into it, shall we? Most of the time in these episodes, when we go through a chapter of scripture, I read through every verse. I am going to spare you that today. And if you happen to look at Nehemiah chapter 3, you will thank me for it. There are way too many ancient Hebrew names for us to go through the entirety of this chapter. But we will hit the highlights, and I'll read some verses as we get to them. So, like I mentioned a second ago, this is now going to be a walk around the walls, a survey of the building project. It starts at the northeastern corner of Jerusalem and takes us on this clockwise journey around the city, almost like a guided tour with Nehemiah saying, come on, let's show you who rebuilt each section. And the first person we meet, I think, is pretty significant. He's Eliashib. He's the high priest, and his fellow priests are rebuilding the sheep gate. And that's a really interesting place for us to begin, because the sheep gate was where the animals would be brought into Jerusalem to be sacrificed at the temple. And by the time of Jesus, this was the area around the Pool of Bethesda. Eliashib's inclusion here with such a glowing commendation is yet another example of how complicated Nehemiah becomes. Because while Eliashib apparently is all on board to help Nehemiah here at the start, by the end of the book, his relationship with Nehemiah is not quite on such good terms. He doesn't go along with what Nehemiah wants by the end of the story. So I guess you either die the hero or you live long enough to become the villain. But in all seriousness, he is somewhat of a sympathetic character, because he is the leader of Israel at this time. He is the high priest, and he already had two Persian Judean governors over him, and then out of nowhere, this foreign official named Nehemiah comes in and takes over. So the fact that he went along with it this much is already saying quite a bit, and I think we can be sympathetic to him when he doesn't always get along with Nehemiah later on. I should also mention, before we go any further, that we don't actually know exactly how long this wall would have been. Estimates usually range roughly around 2 miles in complete length, and probably encompassing somewhere from 100 to 200 acres. So it's definitely not huge, but it's also nothing to scoff at. Well, at least until next chapter when we meet Sanballat and Tobiah. Then they scoff at it, but that's for next week. There is mention of dedication of the sheep gate here at the start, but like I mentioned, Nehemiah is not a chronological book, and we don't actually get the completion of the wall until chapter 6, even though we talk about the wall being completed here in this chapter. So with the dedication, we don't know exactly when that's referring to. It could be the later dedication that happens all the way in chapter 12, verses 27 to 43, or this could be a separate earlier dedication at the start. And this is from Cornerstone Biblical Commentary, where they note that the reason for inserting information about the dedication here could be to assure the reader that the sanctity of the holy place was preserved in spite of all the construction going on around it. The details at the end of this verse are a great example of what I mean about the little hidden gems in these sorts of lists of names chapters, because it would be so easy to gloss right over this and pay no attention when it says that even to the Tower of Meah they sanctified, and to the Tower of Cananil. That means nothing to me. But it should, and it would have meant something to the ancient Judeans hearing this story. If you have a Bible with you, go ahead and flip over to Jeremiah 31:38. If you don't worry, I'll read it for you. Jeremiah 31:38 reads, "Behold, the days come, says Yahweh, that the city will be built to Yahweh from the Tower of Cananil until the gate of the corner." Sounds familiar, right? Well, if you jump over to Zechariah 14:10, that's right before Malachi at the end of our Old Testaments, you would read, "All the land will be turned as a plain from Geba to Ramon south of Jerusalem, and it will be lifted up and inhabited in her place. From Benjamin's gate unto the place of the first gate, unto the corner gate," and here you go, "from the Tower of Cananil unto the king's winepresses." This is where seemingly random details get really interesting, because Jeremiah was writing around the time Jerusalem fell in 586 BCE. Zechariah wrote decades later to the community still dealing with the aftermath of exile, so Zechariah is much closer to Nehemiah's time than Jeremiah was. Both, though, are speaking into this moment of devastation and envisioning a future where Jerusalem is restored. And they both picture the restored Jerusalem featuring this Tower of Cananil rather prominently. So when the first section of Nehemiah's wall includes the Tower of Hananel, I don't think we should treat that as a random detail. Remember, the ancient authors didn't waste ink. So the author of Nehemiah is connecting this rebuilding project with the prophetic hopes of Israel from earlier on. These people aren't just thinking, great, now we can sleep better at night with a wall around us. They are thinking in terms of bigger restoration. The city is being rebuilt. The sacred space is being restored. The Davidic hopes associated with Jerusalem are still alive. The dream of a world put back together has not been abandoned. It would be kind of like if America were to go through some nuclear fallout, right? And everything is destroyed. But there was somebody right around this time before the whole fallout that said, one day, America will be rebuilt starting on Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C. And then decades later, when someone goes to rebuild Washington, D.C., they read about that person who said it would start on Pennsylvania Avenue, and they decide, well, we gotta start on Pennsylvania Avenue then. We have to make it look like it is fulfilling all those prior hopes. This is the restoration we've been looking for. That is exactly what they are doing here. And there's both a beauty and a tragedy to that hope, because as people reading this much later on, we know that when the final stone is placed, Persia's still the ones ruling over them. The throne of David still remains empty, and the restoration that they had longed for is not going to arrive as quickly or fully as they had hoped. Now, that doesn't mean the work is meaningless, though. It just means it is profoundly human. It's important for us to remember that human element as we read these stories. Hey friends, hope you're enjoying listening to the episode so far. Just wanted to interrupt real fast to let you know about Theology Beer Camp coming up in October. It will be October 8th through the 10th in Kansas City, Missouri this fall. It is 3 days of theology nerd heaven. You have these awesome theology sessions, then you have time to just talk with other people who are figuring out their faith, and some fantastic drinks. And even if you are in the sober community, there is even an AA meeting and non-alcoholic options as well. It is a fantastic time. We have had so much fun the last couple years, and we are going to be one of the official God Pods again this year. So that means I have a special discount code that I get to share with you all here. Now, this is just for you all, dear listeners, because you mean so very much to me. So, out of the goodness of my heart, and definitely not because all of the God Pods got this, I have a discount code to share with you for 10% off your ticket price. If you head to theologybeer.camp, that is theologybeer.camp, when you go to buy your tickets, use the code GODPODS10, that is GODPODS10, GODPODS10, and you will get 10% off your order. I hope to see as many of you there as possible. Would love to get to meet some of you that I haven't been able to before. Remember, it's October 8th through the 10th in Kansas City, Missouri, theologybeer.camp. GodPods10 is your discount code for 10% off. All right, let's get back to the episode. Let's keep walking around the wall. As we move into verse 2, we meet the men of Jericho. This is another detail that can be easy to blaze right past. Ezra 2:34, and remember, Ezra and Nehemiah were one book originally. Ezra 2:34 mentions that there were 345 men associated with Jericho who returned from exile. Now, we are not told if all 345 of them were standing out there with a hammer and a bucket of mortar, but this does remind us of how much of a community effort this was, and how people who had a little bit of a negative connotation in previous stories in Scripture are all coming together because the biblical vision would be of all of humanity coming back together to the restored Eden under Yahweh. So this is prefiguring that, I believe. Verse 3 mentions a fish gate, which is also brought up in 2 Chronicles 33:14. And if you're wondering, does that have anything to do with fish? Yes, it probably does. We don't always know exactly why these gates got the names that they did. But a lot of scholars believe that this could have been a gate where merchants would bring fish into the city from the nearby Sea of Galilee. And this is where your imagination can start to run wild a little bit. And you go, could this have been the gate that some fishermen named Peter, James, and John might have sold fish in that area about 400 years later? We have nothing to say for sure that they did, but it's certainly possible. These foundations that Ezra and Nehemiah and Zerubbabel and all these people are laying are the same foundations that are going to be built upon later by Herod in the time of Jesus. So their work absolutely influenced the layout of Jerusalem in Jesus' day. And even if we don't know for sure the exact footsteps of Jesus and his disciples, it is fascinating to think about how the physical spaces of Jerusalem being rebuilt 400 years before them continue to carry those stories across generations. In verse 4, if you have an older translation like the King James, you may have the name Urijah listed, Urijah, but it's actually the same name in Hebrew as Uriah, Bathsheba's husband. Now, I do want to stress, same name, different guy. The Uriah of David story has been dead for several hundred years, and if he showed up with a shovel at this construction site, Nehemiah would have had much bigger theological problems on his hands than just a broken wall. But I bring it up because names matter, especially in a book that keeps drawing connections back to the glory days of Israel's monarchy. We have already seen names that echo the period of David, and we're going to continue to see more of them today. The past is constantly hovering over this chapter, and I think the insertion of names of obviously different people, but the same names as people from previous stories, could very well be hyperlinking to say, this is the time of a renewed monarchy. We are getting back to the days of David. Another weird little textual note for you here. Some older versions, again like King James, might have the name Koz, K-O-Z, whereas newer ones might have it as Hakkoz, H-A-K-K-O-Z. This seems to stem from a misreading of the first letter of this guy's name as being a definite article. I know that gets super nerdy. I promise you, just stick with me for 30 seconds, okay? The definite article, the word the. In Hebrew, it's just the letter that essentially translates over to H for us. So it's just the ha sound. And sometimes it can be on the front of names. So I think what may have happened over time is translators saw that, thought for whatever reason it was talking about the Kaz or Koz, K-O-Z, not realizing that's actually the first couple letters of his name, Hakkoz. So the more modern translations are likely more accurate here. The name should be Hakkoz instead of just Koz. Does that really make a huge difference? Not necessarily. But this is why I always encourage people to read multiple translations, because if you're only stuck with one, you're not necessarily going to see the difference between them. And you might miss out on some debates like this that, I don't know, maybe they don't matter to the average person, but I think it's really interesting when we can see different translations taking different paths. That indicates to us that there's some debate there, and it might be worth further study. You know, ancient languages are complicated. So are modern ones, but we have the context for our modern ones. So when you remove that and we have to try to learn the context as an outsider for the ancient languages, there's going to be some misunderstandings from time to time. Totally normal. We should show a little humility when we're dealing with a 3,000-year-old Hebrew manuscript. Verse 5 gives us a rather fascinating aside about the people of Tekoa. Tekoa might ring a bell for some Bible readers, and if it does, gold star for you because it is a deep cut. But it is the hometown of the prophet Amos, about 300 years earlier than Nehemiah. This was about 10 miles south of Jerusalem. And if you look at the story here in Nehemiah 3, the people of Tekoa are out there doing all the work. The nobles of Tekoa are not. And this is another verse that got ripped out of context and weaponized in church. I guess it's kind of weird. I heard Nehemiah 3 get used a couple of times out of context. For being such an obscure chapter, it can get misused a lot. But the way that I would kind of hear this preached was essentially, don't be like the men of Tekoa, volunteer for every ministry opportunity. If the church needs someone to vacuum the sanctuary at 2 a.m., well, clearly God is calling you. Don't be like the Tekoites. Because verse 5, at least in the Old King James, says that the nobles put not their necks to the work of the Lord. So, put your neck to God's work. Don't skimp on serving church. But that's not really what this text is about. That's not even quite what it says. Go figure, right? If it makes for a really good preaching point, it's probably not what the text actually means. And this particular case is, once again, something you may not realize without reading multiple translations, because the Hebrew doesn't actually say that they refuse to put their necks to the service of the Lord, as many of our English translations make it sound. The word Lord there is actually plural. Now, it is the same word that gets used of Yahweh as being Lord or Master, but when it's referring to him, it is almost always in the singular. And here, it's plural. Why? Because the word can also just refer to human masters or supervisors, and that is exactly what is going on here. This verse is not saying that these people didn't care about serving God. It's saying that the richest people, the leaders, the politicians of this city, were unwilling to serve their human leaders. So this is not a verse about someone refusing to volunteer for enough church events. The criticism is specifically aimed at the nobles. Quite literally, the word means the majestic people, the elites, the one with political status who are unwilling to lower themselves and pick up a shovel. And you know what? I think that critique has actually aged remarkably well, because the people with the most authority, whether in politics, religion, or just life in general, I mean, sometimes even just at your work every day, right? The people with the most authority are often the people most capable of avoiding inconvenience. The people with the most power are often the people who are able to make everyone else carry the burden. This is the ancient equivalent of having a group project where you do a lot of research, you make this awesome PowerPoint, and then somebody else puts their name on it to give the presentation afterward. That's exactly what's going on here. We all know that sort of person. And if you don't know that sort of person, you might be that sort of person. Stop it. Nobody likes that. Stop being like the nobles of Tekoa. I should mention, though, that no reason is actually given for the uncooperativeness of the leaders of Tekoa. Now, in the Cornerstone Biblical Commentary, there is a suggestion that perhaps Geshem, that we met last chapter, he controlled the area just south of that, so perhaps he had some negative influence on those political leaders, but we can't know for sure. As we move into verse 6, we come across the Old Gate. That's some great branding, right? The Old Gate. Well, we actually don't know 100% what this is referring to, because the word for old there, Yeshanah, or sometimes Jeshanah, it's anglicized as, it can mean old, but it can also possibly be the name of a town that is mentioned in 2 Chronicles 13:19. So again, looking to the Cornerstone Biblical Commentary, they say that if the Jeshanah Gate translation is accepted, that would mean that this gate leads to Jeshanah. But Old Gate seems like a more likely translation because, number one, Jeshanah was a minor, obscure city, and number two, the city was situated far from Jerusalem, 15 miles up north near Bethel. And if this gate led to Jeshanah, as is often suggested, it would more likely be on the north side of the city, and this seems to possibly be on the west side of the city. So if Old Gate is accepted, still reading from Cornerstone Biblical Commentary here, then it is usually understood as a gate leading into the Old City, hence the New Living Translation's Old City Gate, from the new city that grew up on the Western Hill. This new area of the city was surrounded by the Broad Wall built during the time of Hezekiah. End quote. So you have a couple different translation options there. I'll also note that Yeshanah word is pretty rare in the Tanakh and shows up mostly in 2 chapters in Leviticus about eating the old fruit from the 6th year of harvest while the land resets for the Jubilee year. So maybe I'm reading too much into this. I am definitely not saying this is an authoritative interpretation, okay? This is just me spitballing here. But I wonder if the author chose this particular rare word here to suggest that a residue of God's blessing was still active in the lives of the Judeans all these years later while they were trying to rebuild. Just like the residue of fruit from the 6 years harvest would carry you through the Jubilee year as the land reset, perhaps the author was thinking that God's blessing from back then still carried through as the land reset during exile. I don't know. Love to hear from you, your thoughts. If you think I'm way off base or maybe onto something, sound off in the comments, let us know. Verse 7 includes this strange detail about people from Gibeon and Mitzpah working on the wall. And this gets into some of the politics of the area, because it's possible that the Gibeonites who helped were not under the authority of that local governor. They may have been responsible to the governor on the other side of the Euphrates River, at least according to some commentaries like the KJV Bible commentary. So if that's the case, we would see Jerusalem as operating less like a modern nation state with centralized labor coordination and more like a regional hub that is trying to rebuild itself while surrounding towns decide whether they're in or out. Remember, this is fresh out of the exile. The people are still figuring out their identity. It's still very fluid, still very negotiable, still very fragile. Verse 8 in some older translations like the King James mentions apothecaries, which I don't know about you, but I think of like drugstores when I hear apothecary. That's more of a modern idea. The actual Hebrew word being used here is more along the lines of perfumers. People who helped the ancient world not smell as bad as it did. Remember, people were not going and bathing every day. People did not have access to all of the soaps and body washes and scrubs and everything that we have today. So while there were absolutely perfumes and things to help people smell better back then, the ancient world was not always the best smelling place to live. There's a really nerdy debate about the word at the end of verse 8. Fortified, they fortified Jerusalem unto the broad wall. And depending on your translation, it might be slightly different. Some have restored or rebuilt. But there are a couple of translations that suggest a very different telling of the story. The New Living Translation says they left out a section. The old Darby Bible says they left Jerusalem in its state as far as the broad wall. So you can see those are very different things than repairing, rebuilding, or fortifying. So what's going on there? Well, the word that we have in the Masoretic text of the Hebrew is usually considered to be related to a root word that means to abandon. But when you look at the text, that doesn't seem to make sense. These are the same people building the wall, so saying that they then abandoned it doesn't necessarily seem to fit. But there are similarly spelled, albeit rare words in Hebrew that can mean something along the lines of to restore. So there's this whole scholarly debate about what exactly the word is meant to be here, but it most likely seems to have the idea that they restored or rebuilt, or as the King James had, fortified it. And I want to mention too that the word for broad at the end of this verse is spelled with the same letters as Rahab's name. So again, it just kind of makes me wonder if there's a little bit of a twinkle in the author's eye as he writes about a broad wall that could also be read as Rahab's wall, when Rahab lived along the wall in Jericho. Again, I don't want to stretch it too much, but my brain sees those little potential hyperlinks as maybe being intentional nods back to earlier stories. Verse 9 mentions someone with the name Hur, and of course a story about a new Moses needs a new Hur. If you remember way back to the Israelites wandering around the wilderness, Moses had an assistant named Hur, H-U-R, who helped to hold his hands up in the one famous battle. So again, different Hur, same name. Were there just not that many names to pick from in the ancient world? Or was the author maybe trying to draw hyperlinks back to earlier stories? You can decide. And verse 9 here mentions that he was the ruler of half of Jerusalem. So as we read these next couple verses, we realize that the governance of Jerusalem was split in two. This was the original two-state solution, okay? We have to remember, Persia was a very organized empire when it came to government. There was a ton of red tape, but pretty much the entire empire was subdivided into municipalities ruled by local governors. So verses 9 and 12 of this chapter show us that Jerusalem was somehow co-ruled by two guys at the same time. Verse 9 says Rephaiah ruled half of Jerusalem, and verse 12 says Shallum ruled the other half. And there's a lot of talk in the book of Nehemiah about governors. They would have been those local rulers who answered to Persia. How Nehemiah now fits in alongside these two men who are ruling over Jerusalem is honestly not entirely clear in the book, but we can formulate a pretty good guess. Nehemiah is referred to in these books as the Tirshatha. That's a word we'll get to later. This was a Persian term for a governing official. It seems that Rephaiah and Shallum were what we would call today maybe mayors over Jerusalem, while Nehemiah became the governor of the state, if you will. I'm bringing it into modern American terminology. It's not a perfect one for one. But that would represent the entirety of Judah. It was no longer an independent nation. It was a municipality under the Persian Empire. So this system of foreign governors over Judea would continue all the way into the time of Jesus. Pilate and Herod would be in very similar positions to these men. Verse 10 mentions a guy named Harumaph, which my mouth kept reading ahead of my brain, and it took me about 20 tries of recording this to have it as Harumaph instead of Harumph, okay? Just look at verse 10 in Nehemiah 3 and tell me you don't see Harumph when you first see that. It makes me laugh every time. Harumaph. Verse 11 mentions the Tower of Ovens, and we don't know exactly where that would be, but it seems to be an area where there were ovens, probably for baking bread. So at this point, the chapter is starting to sound like a weird mix of industrial zoning and a fantasy RPG hub, right? We have the Fish Gate, the Old Gate, the Perfume District, the Oven Tower. But there is a serious geographic point going on underneath all this. We're doing this clockwise loop around the city, describing the perimeter like a guided reconstruction tour. This is architectural narration. Verse 13 gets us a little further south. Down in the city, we get to the Valley Gate and to the Dung Gate. And we don't know exactly where these would have been or what they would have been, but it does seem like the Dung Gate was probably relatively close to a landfill area for the city. There's mention of a guy named Hanun, Hanun here, and the only other person with that same name in the Bible is the antagonist to David in 2 Samuel and 1 Chronicles. So I wonder if having someone with the same name here could indicate a restoration of even the critics of the Davidic kingdom in anticipation of a hoped-for renewal. Verse 14 also mentions Beit Hakarem, or Beth Hakarem, as it would look like in English. If you ever see the word Beth in the Bible, it's probably meaning house of something, like Bethlehem, house of bread. So we don't know exactly where this Beth Hakaram was, but it does seem to be close to the south side of Jerusalem. It is only mentioned one other time in Scripture, and that is in Jeremiah, when he describes it as a station where a warning fire could be lit a la Beacons of Gondor. Verse 15 is super cool. Y'all are going to love this, because it mentions the fountain gate and the pool of Siloah. You might know the pool of Siloah by a different name, the pool of Siloam, where Jesus heals the blind man who can't make it to the water in time. We're talking about the exact same place here. It's also the starting point for Hezekiah's tunnel. Notice, though, here in verse 15, that Shallum is said to rebuild not the pool of Siloah or Siloam itself, but the wall around it. This is significant because archaeologists are pretty confident that the pool was not itself rebuilt until around 100 years before Jesus, so about 300 years after this, because we have actually found coins within the pool's lining that date to the second Hasmonean king Alexander Jannaeus, and he would have been from around 100 years before Jesus. So since the coins are embedded in the liner, that suggests that it would not have been rebuilt until that particular king ruled or later. Kind of a cool little detail, right? I know I think so. And if you've been along for the ride this long, you probably do too. Verse 15 also mentions a king's garden that likely got the name by being a garden that belonged to Judean kings, but again, we don't really have any definites about it. Verse 16 mentions another guy by the name of Nehemiah. This particular Nehemiah rules over half of the city of Beth Zor, located around 13 miles south of Jerusalem. And if you have an older version like the King James that says sepulchres here, that just means tombs. And when verse 16 mentions a pool that was made, there are some scholars who guess it was Hezekiah's pool, but we don't really have any certainty about any of these locations. And if someone tells you we do, they're kind of lying to themselves. We have very good guesses, quite frequently, but there are always alternate theories about pretty much every location in the Bible. So we always have to proceed with humility when we talk about the locations of biblical events. There's one other thing here in verse 16 that I want to make sure we touch on, and that's the house of the mighty, or the house of warriors, depending on your translation. It's often assumed to be the barracks where David's mighty men resided. But again, we don't know for sure. We don't really have details about these specific spots. We're just making our best guesses based on the stories that we have. I should also mention that there is a Hebrew word that shows up only in this chapter, and it's all throughout this chapter. It's a word that the Old King James translates as part, like they built to the half part of the city or to the part that was in front of them. And a lot of more modern translations will have it as the word district. And that's a pretty good translation. It just means the area for which people were responsible. So if you see that word part or district, it's just talking about whatever they were responsible for rebuilding. Verse 20 is fascinating to me because Baruch alone, of all the people mentioned in this chapter, he alone gets an adverb for his work. Everyone else is said to rebuild. He is said to rebuild earnestly. And really, that root word means angrily. So it likely implies that he was doing quick, very zealous work. Verse 21 mentions the same people that we had back in verse 4. Verse 22 mentions the plain, and that's likely the Jordan Valley area. That's another fascinating Hebrew word, or at least I think the etymology of it is fascinating, because the word translated plain there in verse 22, it originally just meant something round. And then over time it came to be used for things that were round, like the coin that the older versions called a talent, like if you remember the parable of the talents, or somebody brought this many talents of gold or whatever, it's talking about a round coin there. It also came to refer to a loaf of bread that was round, or, in this case, an open field in a somewhat round shape. Verse 25 mentions the tower which lies out from the king's high house by the court of the prison, and that is a direct reference back to Jeremiah, because Jeremiah had been kept in that exact prison several times. And I think it's kind of interesting that they included that because Jeremiah prophesied some of the return that they are living out now. So really interesting hyperlink to mention that. Verse 26 has this weird word, the Nethinims. They were temple servants. I think we've mentioned this before, but whenever you have a Bible word that ends in that IMS, it's probably just a Hebrew word that got transliterated rather than translated into English. The IM ending is already plural, so adding an S to it is a little redundant. It was more acceptable like 300 to 400 years ago in English, but it still bugs me. I don't like when plural Hebrew words get translated into English and then have an S added onto the already plural Hebrew suffix. We do the same thing with seraphims, cherubims. Okay, those are not technically the proper plural. Cherubim is already plural. Seraphim is already plural. Nethanim is already plural. All right, mini rant over. This Nethanim word, it just means appointed ones. Really creative name, right? They were basically the temple slaves or servants that would have been the gophers doing whatever needed to be done in the temple. Verse 29 mentions a Zadok, Z-A-D-O-K, and an Immer. What a great name, right? Immer, I-M-M-E-R. Well, wouldn't you know that in the days of David, there was a priest named Zadok, and there was an Immer as well. Once again, I'm thinking intentional hyperlinks back to the time of David. Verse 30 has this weird detail that I don't have a great answer for why it's there, but I do want to point it out. It reads, after him repaired Hananiah, the son of Shelemiah, and Hanun, the sixth son of Tzalaph. So it's just the mention of his being the sixth son of Tzalaph. If there were at least 5 other sons that this Tzalaph had, why were they not mentioned here as well? Did they not help out? Were they all dead? Were they somewhere else? Did they not come back to the land after the exile? I I don't know. We can't know. And maybe at the time of its writing, everyone knew why only the sixth son was singled out, and it just made sense, and we have lost that reasoning to time. It's a good example of how the Bible was written in a specific time and place that we do not share. And so while we can absolutely find things that are worth taking out of these stories, they weren't originally written to us. They have a context that mattered long before we ever came around. And that's worth keeping in our minds so that we don't take these verses out of context. All right, I have a few just weird little tidbits of Hebrew nerdiness that I want to share with you here as we are at the last verse of the chapter. For starters, while this is the last verse of the chapter in our English Bibles, the Hebrew chapter actually goes on for another 6 verses. Now, those are not 6 missing verses from our English translation. We just have them as chapter 4, verses 1 through 6. And we've talked about this before on the podcast, where sometimes our English chapter divisions don't always line up with the Hebrew or Greek chapter divisions. It's almost always in the Old Testament that happens. It's less common in the New Testament. And it's not a matter of missing verses or anything being taken out. It's just the fact that these verse divisions are a relatively recent addition to Scripture. And they're pretty subjective. I mean, we've gotten used to them. We can't imagine John 3:16 being anything other than John 3:16. But when these were originally written, there were no chapter and verse divisions. So it is subjectively chosen. And sometimes the people who chose them did a better job than at other times. And this is actually a case where I kind of prefer the English division. I almost always favor the earlier Hebrew division. But in this case, I think it makes decent sense to cut off at verse 32, because then the next verses get into Sanballat and Tobiah, which are more a part of the next section. So I'm going to stop our episode here at verse 32, as it is in English, and take care of all of the verses of our English chapter 4 next time. Speaking of verse divisions, you may have heard before about some of the very strenuous practices that the Masoretes had in order to preserve the exact right wording of the Tanakh. Some of those legends that you hear are true, some not so much, and most of those practices are things that were instituted after the time of Jesus, so they don't necessarily speak into the preservation of the Old Testament as much as we always like to say. That's a different matter for a different time. But there is one standard they had that sometimes gets mentioned, and it is true, and that is often they would have a marker saying what the middle word of a book of the Bible is supposed to be. So if you have, I don't know, let's just throw out a number and say 1,000 words in a book of the Bible, well, they'll have a little mark next to the 500th word to say, count up the words. This is supposed to be the middle point. This is supposed to be the 500th word. If you have gotten to this point and you have a different 500th word, you done screwed up somewhere, and we got to redo it, right? So why is that significant here? Because there is a little mark in the Hebrew text next to this particular verse. This verse is not the middle of Nehemiah, but it is the middle of Ezra Nehemiah. So if you've heard me over the last several episodes of this series mentioning that Ezra and Nehemiah were one book together, and you go, how do I know that for sure? I've never seen that in an English Bible. Well, this is one way that we can know that for sure, that they were originally considered one book, because our little halfway mark is here in this verse that is not halfway through Nehemiah, but it is halfway through Ezra Nehemiah. So that's just a cool little detail. One other bit of randomness I'll throw out to you here is that if this whole chapter has felt repetitious to you, don't worry, you are not the first one to think that. The Masorete scribes added several markings and symbols to the text of the Tanakh to help not just with copying, like we mentioned, but also with pronunciation, organization, and sometimes even interpretation. And a common mark they'd add is just the letter samak. It's roughly equivalent to an S that we have in English. And when it's used after a line of text, it stands for the word setuma, which means closed, and it indicates a soft paragraph break, while also indicating that the thought will continue in the next sentences. So it's saying the very specific thought ends here, but the general thought is going to continue. And there's also a harder break with the letter pe, which kind of translates over to a P for us, and that stands for petaka, which wouldn't be more of just a full paragraph break. So if you were to read this chapter in Hebrew, you would see those little samaks, those little S's at the end of many of these lines, because the scribes were trying to keep it organized. It's almost like they added little bullet points, if you will, so it all wouldn't blend together and you wouldn't get lost going through all these names. So that's something that we lose when we just read it in English. I don't know of any English translation that carries that over because it's just not really something we do. But I think it's kind of a cool little detail that's worth sharing. We have now made it together through a chapter that makes the Silmarillion look like a Cliff Notes summary. But hopefully you enjoyed finding the little random details hidden throughout here. Because this chapter isn't just about building a wall. It isn't just a nostalgic return to a past version of the city either. It is an attempt at reconstituting life after rupture, with all the complexity that comes with that kind of moment in a people's story. The wall becomes a shared object of attention, but what's really being revealed here is how the community behaves when it has to decide what still holds together after everything has come apart. And this chapter doesn't really resolve that tension for us. It doesn't tell us how unified this moment felt from the inside, or how evenly the burdens were shared. It simply records that it happened, and shows some ambiguity in whether or not people fully went along with Nehemiah. And as we'll get into the next chapter, that unfinished quality is going to matter a lot more than it might seem at first glance. So as chapter 3 concludes, you are left with something that feels, honestly, less like a conclusion and more like a pause in the middle of a movement. The wall isn't completely finished, and the story certainly isn't. What we do get, though, instead, is a snapshot of coordinated effort of people from different places, different roles, different levels of status, all orienting themselves around a shared task in a shared space that had been deeply disrupted. And that matters because there can be a tendency, both in the narrative and how we read it, to compress this moment into something cleaner than it actually was. But I think Nehemiah 3 resists that. It preserves the unevenness, the repetition, the fact that restoration is not a single act, but a distributed process that only becomes visible when you list down in full. Remember the line we've said throughout this episode? Ancient authors don't waste ink. The preservation of this material is not incidental. I know it's not the most fascinating read ever. You would be forgiven for wanting to skip over it in your read through the Bible in a year plan. But it is intentionally here for remembrance. Whatever you make of the motivations of the people, the text is clearly trying to ensure that ordinary labor is not lost to anonymity. The rebuilding of the wall is matched with a rebuilding of memory, one that embeds the people into the story of this ancient city in a way that outlives the moment itself. And yet, it would be too simplistic to turn that into a universal celebration of unity of effort. The chapter doesn't smooth out the differences between the participants. It doesn't pretend that everyone is equally enthusiastic or equally positioned within the social structure of Judah. You can still feel the stratification running underneath the surface. The officials, the regional groups, the temple servants, the craftsmen, the nobles who abstain from participation, and the ordinary laborers who carry most of the visible weight. That sounds exactly what an actual reconstruction of a city would sound like. When you step back from it, the wall becomes almost secondary. What you remember is the accumulation of people. The sense that restoration, whatever else it is not carried by a single voice or a single institution. It emerges from distributed effort that is held together loosely, but meaningfully around a shared center. And that leaves us as readers with a kind of unresolved tension that the book does not rush to fix. If anything, it deepens it, because the next chapters will immediately begin to test whether this kind of collective effort can hold under pressure. External opposition, internal fatigue, and political complexity are all waiting for us just around the turn of a page. So the end of Nehemiah 3 is not really an ending at all. It's the moment where you realize the work has begun in earnest, but the conditions that made it necessary have not gone away yet. The wall is rising, but so are the questions about what kind of community is being formed in the process of building it. And that's where the story leaves you, standing at the edge of a half-formed boundary, watching a people try to rebuild not just the city, but also their own sense of coherence after collapse, without any guarantee that the reconstruction will resolve the deeper fractures that made the rebuilding necessary in the first place. And we'll get into that a lot more next time when we read through chapter 4 together. Until then, though, stay curious and keep asking questions about the Uncut and Unfiltered Bible. You've been listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We hope we provided a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. If you enjoyed the podcast, would you take a minute to share it with a friend? You could also rate and review on your podcast app. If you'd like to donate to keep our work going, you can go to our website, thebibleuncut.com, and click on the Support Us tab. While you're there, check out the recommended resources and blog where we post show notes and other articles. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.